Hi everyone, welcome to another Tech Talk with Samir, where I talk about anything and everything related to technology in my life. If you haven't already, please check out some of my recent videos and consider subscribing to the channel and helping me grow this thing. I have an embarrassingly low amount of subscribers, which is not good for my ego. So please do me a favor and hit subscribe. So remember when desktop computers were a thing? Nowadays, with laptops, tablets, and smartphones at everyone's disposal, desktops have kind of lost its glory. So I guess you can kind of say they're becoming obsolete. Not so fast. In my last video where I shared my initial thoughts on the Nikon Z6 II camera, I mentioned that I would eventually transition to shooting my videos in 4K, but I needed a few more pieces to that puzzle to make it all work. One of the biggest obstacles to creating and consuming higher quality content is that you need devices that can facilitate that. When it comes to 4K videos, as a consumer, you need a 4K screen, whether that's your 4K TV, computer screen, or even tablets. And as a creator like myself, I need the tools that help me create the content. For example, my new camera. However, shooting a video is just one small part of the entire creative process. Putting it all together is where most of the work happens. When you're watching these videos, you may not realize, but a 10-minute video can take several hours to put together, and that's after the videos have already been shot. If you've ever tried doing any video editing, you probably already know that you need a pretty fast device to do it efficiently. My preferred software for editing videos is Adobe Premiere Pro, and on slower computers, it really tests my patience. As great as modern laptops have become over the years, a similar priced desktop is almost always more powerful. Computer hardware makers don't have as many constraints when designing hardware for desktops as they do with laptops, mostly because size, power efficiency, and thermals are not as big of a concern. So their highest end products are almost always designed for desktops. So going back to my initial question about whether desktops are going obsolete, it most certainly has not for many people, including myself. As I make this transition over to making 4K content for this channel, I needed a more powerful computer to help me do it more efficiently. The computer I have been using up until now was a desktop I built 7 years ago. At the time, I put a lot of effort into putting together something that best suited my needs, and my needs 7 years ago mostly revolved around gaming. Generally, when a computer is built with gaming in mind, it typically ends up having higher end components since gaming is very demanding when it comes to computer hardware. As a result, in the last 7 years, there's been very few times I felt the need to upgrade anything. 7 years ago, I equipped my computer with an Intel Core i7-4770K CPU along with 32 gigs of RAM and an NVIDIA GTX 770 graphics card. Over the years, I did upgrade the graphics card a few times, but aside from that, everything else has remained the same. With the need for more computing power due to my increased video editing requirements, as well as the recent release of AMD's 5000 series CPUs, I finally convinced myself that it was time to build another PC. So, it was time to go shopping. The first thing I wanted to secure was the CPU. Initially, I wanted to get the AMD Ryzen 5900X, but it was sold out everywhere on launch day. In the city where I live, there's a local Micro Center store. I decided to try my luck by physically going there on launch day, and unsurprisingly, the 5800X was sold out there as well. However, they did have a couple of Ryzen 9 5900X. At that point, since I had already made the drive, I just decided to shell out the extra $100 and get that instead. I later realized that it was a good call because after that day, it's been impossible to find any AMD 5000 series CPUs. Also, since I hope to use this computer for several years going forward, it was an unintentional way to future-proof my setup. The 5900X is a 12-core CPU that blows away pretty much anything Intel has to offer at this time. If you have a Micro Center nearby, it's a great place to start off when buying parts to build a new computer. They tend to have discounts if you bundle parts together. I decided to pick up my motherboard while I was there. I picked out the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Elite motherboard. For me personally, this motherboard had all the IOs and expansion slots I needed without breaking the bank. When it comes to AMD's 5000 series CPUs, at the time of making this video, you really have only two choices when it comes to the motherboard chipset, either the B550 or the X570. Although the X570 is technically the higher end product, the B550 in my opinion is the better value given that the sacrifices that were made to lower the price are features that I likely would not have used to begin with, like the increased number of PCI Express 4.0 lanes. Not to mention, the X570 motherboards have a built-in fan to cool the chipset. I've never been a fan of having fans on the motherboard. That's just one more potential point of failure in the long run. So for me, this B550 motherboard had everything I was looking for. While I was at Micro Center, I also decided to pick up an SSD. Now, when I built my previous computer back in 2013, SSDs and hard drives were still primarily SATA-based drives. M.2 NVMe SSDs weren't a thing back then. If you didn't know, NVMe SSDs are exponentially faster than SATA-based SSDs, and these days they're very competitively priced for mass consumption. Besides the insane speeds, my personal favorite thing about the NVMe SSDs is that they go directly onto the motherboard rather than connecting with a cable. This allows you to have a much cleaner setup. I decided to pick up a 1TB Western Digital Black SN750 SSD. Since I bundled it with my CPU and motherboard, I was able to get some additional discounts for this as well. For the remaining items, I started browsing around on the internet for deals. For RAM, I ended up getting a 2x32GB Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro kit for a total of 64GB of memory. I decided to get 2x32 because it will have 2 RAM slots open for potentially upgrading to 128GB of memory down the road. This RAM kit has built-in RGB lights. I was hoping to make this more of a low-key type of build and not make it too in your face, but it was the best deal I could find at the time, so I'll take it. I could always turn off the RGB lights if it becomes too distracting. It may surprise you, but a $550 CPU does not come with a CPU cooler. I guess they figured that anyone who's spending that much on a CPU can afford to buy an aftermarket cooler. So the entire box for the CPU basically just had the tiny little chip in it. I was going to buy an aftermarket cooler anyways, so I'm only complaining because, hey, I need a little more drama in this channel. This did, however, leave me with a dilemma. In my last PC build, I used a Corsair all-in-one liquid cooler. I loved how clean the overall setup inside my case looked with it. However, recently the pump on that cooler stopped working, resulting in my CPU reaching 100 degrees while rendering videos in Handbrake. I was always worried of the day the pump would fail, because if the pump fails, you really have no other choice but to replace the entire cooler. Because of this recent development, the choice was pretty much made for me. I was going to only have air cooling in this build. However, that doesn't mean that I'm going the cheap route. I ended up getting the Noctua NH-U12A cooler. At $100, it's very much in the price range of some liquid cooling systems, but this time around, I'm going for reliability rather than aesthetics. I mean, I think we can all agree that Noctua's color theme is ugly as shit. But at least for an air cooler, it performs very well and operates very quietly, and I no longer have to worry about a pump potentially failing. The next thing I needed was the computer case itself. I was looking for something relatively inexpensive and functional at the same time. I came across the Corsair 4000D Airflow. It looked to have the perfect combination of features and pricing, so I just went ahead and ordered that one. Although I do wish it had more front accessible USB ports. After the case arrived, I was really surprised at how much smaller this case was compared to my old case. This was mostly because modern cases no longer have an area for optical drives, so they can significantly reduce the footprint of the case. This case specifically has a very airflow oriented design. It has ventilation on the front, top, rear, and bottom. Despite being smaller than my old case, it has plenty of room to operate during the build process. When it came to the power supply, I already had an 850 watt one sitting at home from my days of cryptocurrency mining, so I just decided to use that rather than buying a new one. It's an EVGA Supernova 850G G3. It's a fully modular 80+ gold certified power supply. Although I plan on keeping this build fairly simple, this power supply has plenty of capacity and expansion capabilities if I choose to do so down the road. The final major piece of hardware I needed was a graphics card. In an ideal world, I would go out and get an NVIDIA RTX 3080, but unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, especially not in 2020. NVIDIA's 3000 series cards have been sold out everywhere ever since they launched almost 2 months ago. But that's okay, since I don't plan on doing any gaming on this computer, I decided to just transfer my RTX 2070 from my old computer to this one. It's still a perfectly capable graphics card, and for my specific needs, it should be just fine for the time being. After I got all the parts on hand, it was time to start the build. The first thing I did was take out the hard drive cage from the bottom compartment of the case. Since I don't plan on using any mechanical hard drives, I figured I could use the room for some cable management. One of the drive bays contained a small box with all the screws and accessories I'll need to complete the build, so I put that aside. I then connected all the necessary cables to the power supply. I wanted to do this before mounting the power supply because it may be hard to reach once it's in there. For this build, I only needed the 24-pin motherboard cable, the 8-pin CPU cable, and the 8-pin PCI Express cable for the graphics card. I love the fact that I can just put away all the cables I don't need to keep the clutter to the minimum. This is the beauty of a modular power supply. I then mounted the power supply to the case. It's really nice that the cases these days have a completely separate compartment for the power supply. This makes it really easy to hide excess lengths of cables. With the power supply mounted, it was time to move on to the motherboard. The first order of business was to install the beast itself. This is the first time I'm building an AMD based computer for myself, so I had to look up instructions online to make sure I was following the correct procedures. It's not too different from installing an Intel CPU, but the fact that the pins are on the CPU itself rather than the socket makes it so that you have to be a little more careful to not potentially bend the pins when you're handling it. The key is to make sure you don't use any any force. When inserted correctly, it should just fall right into the socket and no force is required. Can you believe this tiny little chip costs more than a PlayStation 5? At least I was lucky enough to find this one in stock, unlike a PS5. I then went ahead and installed the SSD onto my motherboard. My motherboard came with an included heatsink for the NVMe slot, so I had to remove it before inserting the SSD into the slot. I wanted to do this before installing the CPU cooler, in case it becomes too hard to reach with the cooler being mounted. After that, it was time to mount the CPU cooler on top of the CPU. I followed Noctua's very clear instructions to mount the cooler. I first installed a mounting bracket specific to the AM4 socket, then I applied a tiny bit of thermal paste on top of the CPU before going ahead and securing the heatsink to the bracket. If you're wondering, the cooler did come with the thermal paste and all the necessary tools to do the install, and I didn't have to buy anything separately. You can always mount the cooler after installing the motherboard into the case, but I like to do it before so that I have more room to work with. With this cooler, you have to take the fans off while mounting the cooler, and you have to put it back on after you've secured the cooler onto the motherboard. It was finally time to install the motherboard into the case. It was just a matter of lining up the I/O shield in the back and aligning all the mounting holes with the corresponding motherboard risers on the case. Then it was just a matter of screwing it into place. Since some of the holes are a little hard to reach, it's a good idea to use a magnetic screwdriver to make your life a little easier. I then went ahead and connected all the cables to put everything together. I got some extensions for my power supply cables to make it easier to reach the connectors. It also adds to the aesthetics of the build if you're into that stuff. After that, I installed the RAM modules onto the motherboard. Typically I would do it earlier in the build process, but the RAM came in late, so I didn't want to delay the rest of the build while I was waiting on the RAM. It was then time to install all my devices onto the PCI expansion slots. First thing I installed was my RTX 2070 graphics card. I used the topmost PCIe slot for this because that one is a 4.0 slot where the other ones are 3.0. Not that it matters for the moment with my current graphics card. One final device I installed was my 10 gigabit network card. If you haven't seen it already, check out the recent video I made about upgrading to a 10 gigabit network in my home. This motherboard does have a built-in 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, which is more than double the speed of a typical Ethernet port, but I still wanted to maximize my newly decked out home network, so I installed a 10 gigabit card from my old computer. With that, the build was finally complete, and it was time to plug in the power and hit the power button. I then went ahead and did all the boring stuff like installing Windows and my essential applications to bring everything up to speed. I did go back and make one small change after the initial build. I transferred my Creative Sound Blaster sound card to the new computer. I really tried using the onboard audio for a bit, hoping that I would not notice the difference. I'm not an audiophile, but I noticed a significant difference in audio quality favoring the sound card from my old computer, so I just went ahead and installed it into the new one. So now the big question, how does it actually perform? To no one's surprise, it beats the living out of my old computer. Working in Adobe Premiere Pro, I can scrub through all the footage without any hiccups, as well as render videos at a significantly faster rate. The comparison you see has the same graphics card on both setups, so it's pretty much an apples to apples comparison for all the newly added components. If you haven't already noticed, this video is in 4K. I was finally able to create 4K content with the help of this computer as well as my new camera. Aside from the performance gains in my video editing workflow, I also noticed things are just generally more snappier. The much faster NVMe SSD seems to have made quite a bit of difference when it comes to loading times for applications. I initially thought that 64 gigabytes of RAM would be a bit of an overkill, but to my surprise, there were times when editing in Premiere, I was using up almost 50 gigs of RAM. You know how I said I don't plan on doing any gaming on this? Well, that's not 100% true. Did you really expect me to build a high-end computer and not do any gaming on it? This whole thing about wanting a new PC to be more productive was really just an excuse to build a computer that can run Flight Simulator smoothly. Ever since I got Microsoft's latest iteration of Flight Simulator on launch day, I knew my days with my old PC were limited. Although it was playable at lower settings, I was missing out on a lot of bells and whistles. Flight simulators have always been more CPU limited, and this time around it's no different. Upgrading the CPU alone made all the difference for my 1440p setup. Although I'm very happy with this build, if I can somehow get a hold of an RTX 3080 in the coming months, that would truly complete this build. If and when that happens, I'll make sure to make an update video about it, so subscribe and stay tuned for that one. Hope you've enjoyed watching this computer build video as much as I enjoyed making it. I can't wait to use this new PC to help me make more videos like this. This video will hopefully be the first of many to come in 4K resolution. As always, I'll have Amazon affiliate links to all the items I've mentioned in the description. description. If you choose to buy anything using the links, I'll get a small commission from Amazon, which will help me bring you more fun content, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe so that you don't miss any of my upcoming content. Stay safe, and I'll see you on the next one.